So Robert Reinhardt, good morning to Robert. 20 years of industry experience. He's authored a number of technical books and is currently focused on building custom Wowza-based workflows. So I think, Robert, you're able to share, should be able to.
Stand by. You got a good mic on me?
Yeah, hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Let me go ahead and share my desktop. All right.
Yeah, see WebRTC today.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me, Christopher. Admittedly, I didn't have as much prep time on this because the Streaming Media East Connect virtual conference started this week with the workshops. Jan Ozer, who I think many of you may be familiar with, I know he's worked with many of you at your company. And I know there's others that aren't from SSM. I can't even pronounce your company right now. I've only had coffee this morning, so my apologies. Coffee and water, thanks. The Stream Media East Connect started this week, and it's all free next week. So if you want to attend Stream Media online, go for it. It's registration is free. The workshops are paid this week. I just did an FFmpeg beginner class, and I'm doing an advanced one tomorrow. So, but when I was talking to Christopher about this, I was really interested in being part of this Ontario user group. Just in general, just here on Salt Spring where I live, Salt Spring Island, BC. I am an American originally. I married a BC girl who grew up in the Chilcotin here, and absolutely love being back in Canada. I studied at Ryerson and have my degree in film and photography there. So I have a rich image arts background, and it's always been central to the development that I do. I have a quick slide on just sort of the different hats I wear. I'm a self-titled video solutions architect. When I worked at when I lived in Los Angeles back in the early 2000s, I was the VP of multimedia applications for a company called Schematic. They were bought up by WPP, which is a huge global organization, and changed their name to Possible Worldwide after I had left the company. But I basically had oversight of their Flash application development. So I managed teams in the various offices there, and we often called ourselves solutions architects, and that's a very common word. So our title these days, and I just put the word video in front of that because my solutions architecture is very much specific to video. I do a lot of encoding workflow work. A lot of my clients come to me to improve their FFmpeg workflow specifically, or even just H.264 optimizations. As Christopher mentioned too, I do a lot of Wowza streaming engine development. I would say based on the time of year and just what clients are coming to me, a lot of my work revolves around the Wowza ecosystem, but I was on an emergency call this morning with the National Institutes of Health in Washington, D.C. I worked with that team to migrate them off of Adobe Media Server to Wowza last year, and getting their, as you can imagine, the NIH is inundated now with a lot of video just related around coronavirus. I also technically direct webcasts for the BC government. A good part of my business was doing on-site video work. I've helped the BC government move a lot of their infrastructure online to the cloud with webcasting particularly, and directing their social media webcasts. But most of the work I do is, getting people and their solutions up to where they need it to be, and then I do a knowledge transfer, and then I'm out. I'm not day-to-day technical support for the vast majority of my clients. I also write for Stream Media Magazine. You can look up a lot of my articles there. And like I just mentioned, I do a lot of work in the States. I actually have two companies. I have the Makers LLC in the United States for all my US clients and foreign clients. And here in Canada specifically, I have a BC corporation. So any Canadian work goes through that Canadian entity. And I like to advertise as well that my Canadian clients get a pretty good discount on my hourly rate, because I don't bill out my US rate in Canadian dollars. I would not be affordable to most of my Canadian clients. But anyhow, moving on, and just a quick slide on some of the webcast kind of setups I've done. I wanted to just jump right into WebRTC. You know, it's no surprise. Obviously, you're running these meetings virtually. Everyone is having to move to virtual environments for meetings these days, and for larger events and presentations. I did a free webinar a month or so back in late March, just talking about your options for real-time communication. This is by no means a comprehensive graph. I'll have this slide deck available. I'll give the link to Christopher so that he can disseminate to the group. But these are the kinds of features, you know, being able to manage contacts, text chats, screen share, all the kind of things that you see in Zoom and their competition. Not all of these are WebRTC based. Most of the, I would say, like, you know, Skype isn't using WebRTC, Zoom isn't using WebRTC. They do have WebRTC variants to allow browser compatibility, but their core tech is not WebRTC, a lot of these companies. But that's changing, and that's mainly because the landscape for server tech is changing. There's just a lot more options now to integrate WebRTC. Browsers are finally on that page where, you know, pretty much universally we can look at H.264 as a codec that's available for WebRTC. The VP family of codecs is there as well, and can introduce problems when you're trying to scale and you know, manage an infrastructure that has to implement a WebRTC backbone. I list Wowza and Red 5 Pro mainly as, you know, companies that, you know, added WebRTC to their offerings because they were traditionally RTMP architectures that evolved, you know, since the days of Flash. I mentioned to Christopher too that I'm really happy. It's just a coincidence, really, that he's in my neck of the woods. When I say he, Jared Venema, the CEO of Frozen Mountain, they're based in Burnaby, you know, suburb of Vancouver, and I've been using LiveSwitch with 2 clients to date. And I really like their licensing model. More importantly, I really like their tech. In fact, I use LiveSwitch now as a comparison model for any other tech that I'm looking at in terms of WebRTC. Can they do everything that LiveSwitch does? Great. If they can't, how is that going to affect the business requirements for deployment? My good friends Richard and Jerry run Millicast. Richard and Jerry. They have Richard Blakely and Jerry Chaboya out of Southern California, ran a hosting company called Influxus. If you've been to past streaming media conferences, you may have seen Influxus's brand, but they now have Millicast as a offering that's on the cloud for WebRTC connections. I'll come back to one of their key resources, as he's got a lot of great resources online. Twilio and Vonage. Vonage just recently acquired TalkBox. Twilio and TalkBox are WebRTC-based platforms. Janus is open source, so if you're looking to, you know, kick the tires on WebRTC and you're not a stranger to, you know, launching AWS instances or Azure or wherever you're running your cloud platforms, or just on your own laptop or local machine, there are options out there. Jitsi is open source as well, and there's other flavors of WebRTC out there. If you go to GitHub and just search for WebRTC, you'll likely find any number of open source projects that people have started around WebRTC. The problem with WebRTC, I find, is that there's no common SDK. So if you build to one of these platforms, you will likely have to do a lot of rebuilding to migrate to another solution, just like with a lot of platforms out there, right? If I have all my video content on Brightcove and I want to move it somewhere else, it's not going to be an easy proposition, right? It's not like there's some commonly exported format for library catalogs that these vendors are using. They're going to make it reasonably difficult for you to, you know, move content and any of the data that they've put together for you to another service. And it's no different with WebRTC offerings. I wish I could say if you built a WebRTC front end, that you would be able to, either augment your scale capacity by using different vendors. It's not an easy HTTP scale kind of scenario. WebRTC is a real-time protocol. It suffers many of the scale challenges that Flash back in the early days with RTMP suffered. Like you can't use an HTTP edge delivery network to scale out WebRTC. It's just not part of the equation. So and I'm going to jump quickly. Like I said, this slide deck is going to be available if you want to click the links or whatnot. I'm going to come back to this relay feature because I think it's for me and a lot of the clients that approach me with their business requirements for video streaming in general, the ability to, take an experience and push it out to, social media platforms or any other ingest can be key to the success of that platform or product or whatever it is that they're building. And I'll talk about Relay. I'm going to come back to this slide. I stole this slide from LiveSwitch's web page or website rather, from their documentation, because it illustrates one of the key problems with WebRTC. There are these different modes that you can use WebRTC, and I think it's important to understand how these modes work. I've been working for 2 years for a client that's slowly been evolving a communications platform. We started with peer-to-peer. We've pivoted to, basically allow all three of these modes. And these are by no means exclusive to LiveSwitch. Again, this is sort of at the core of WebRTC, how you manage connections. And so if I'm just having, and Zoom works, with similar, even non-WebRTC platforms are going to work in a similar way when it comes to negotiating network connections and, more importantly, managing available bandwidth. Peer-to-peer works great when you only have a few people on a call, largely one-on-one. I would say anything beyond one-on-one communication, you're starting to have a very high-risk proposition with available bandwidth with peer-to-peer, because every person has to send their bits to every other person in that chat, as you can see in that diagram. If there's 3 people on a call, I have to send my stream to, or in this case, there's 4 people on a call. It's n-1, right? There's 4 people. I am responsible for 3 streams down, 3 streams up, and that doesn't scale very well with most users' connection speeds. Moving on to SFU, or selective forwarding unit, there's a server in the middle there that can negotiate that. Most of the tech that I had on that last page, Wowzer Red 5, they're going to support this SFU capability, where at least we're removing the upbound out of the equation. I only have to send my audio and video and data channel upbound to a central service or server, and that service is responsible for disseminating the other downstreams. And so, but that's still, like, if I'm on my, iPhone and I don't have a really great 3G connection or 4G connection, as is often the case when I'm getting off the ferry here on Salt Spring, and if I'm on a call, like, that's a tricky proposition, because my bandwidth requirements are going up as more people join the call. My upbound is still good. I don't have to get it out to everyone on that call. The server's taking care of that, but I still have to take those other bits down. The other thing that's problematic with peer-to-peer is the whole codec situation, right? So if I'm broadcasting in H.264 and another client is broadcasting in VP9, and I don't have a decode capability, or the other party doesn't, then we have a problem right away with peer-to-peer. There's no, common codec necessarily that's being passed. Now, WebRTC has a negotiation process where clients basically present their options to a server that's even with peer-to-peer, you usually have a negotiating server in between that establishes the initial connection, and then all the bits start to flow. There's also NAT traversal problems with peer-to-peer. So if my firewall isn't set up properly, peer-to-peer might fail right away. It does work for the most part, though. Networks are getting more savvy to these kind of UDP connections and dynamic port assignments. So it's getting better and better over time. going back to SFU, when you've got the server there can also take care of those transcoding issues that I just mentioned. The server can do a transcode on the fly if that server tech supports it to between those codec mismatches. So if someone's up broadcasting in VP9, I can get something back that isn't going to be problematic with my decode set. But the good news is that you can set priorities in your client when you're programming WebRTC clients and WebRTC backends. You can usually set a priority. In Wowza, the default is a VP codec, and then secondary is H.264. But you can change that up so that you can make H.264 the priority. So if a client supports it, then push H.264. Audio is almost always in the Vorbis or Opus codec, and so that's problematic when you're more for the MP4 container type. If you were glancing at that chart I showed earlier, recording is an option in most of these platforms that you can use. And in a lot of the WebRTC roll your own solutions, right? If you're hosting your own WebRTC server or building out your own WebRTC farm, archiving is probably going to be one of those business requirements that, of course, I want to record my calls or, have an archive available of it, just like Zoom does and other platforms. And so recording those, each of those recordings that are coming into the server and syncing them can be sometimes problematic. But this is where we get into this last model, the MCU, the multi-point control unit, or the multi-conferencing unit. There's different. It's funny. MCU has different meaning. People have chosen to have MCU stand for different things. LiveSwitch refers to it as the multi-point control unit. One of the links I have in a resource page that I put together for this presentation refers to it as multi-conferencing unit, but it's the same concept where basically it doesn't matter how many people you have on a call. There's only one upbound and one upstream and one downstream. So the server is not only responsible for negotiating connections and disseminating everyone's streams, it's actually responsible for aggregating those streams into one feed. So, we've got, I don't know how many people are in this call. It looks like at least a dozen or so people that if we were all active participants, we would actually be, in an MCU scenario where each contributing our upbound, whether that's audio only or video and audio, and the server is responsible for compositing those video planes together so that I basically receive just one video from the server with a grid. And that can be problematic too, because you now have layout constraints, and how are you going to present that? Especially on mobile, if you've got a horizontal grid and you want to show it in a portrait, maybe you don't even choose to show video on mobile. There's all sorts of business decisions that happen on a client level in any of these architectures when it comes to mobile versus desktop. But MCU really, what I like about the whole MCU capability is that you have this server component doing mixing. And one of the things I wanted to highlight, and this again, I use LiveSwitch as setting the bar for what I now look for in other services when I'm evaluating them. I have it here. I have a very short list of resources. I apologize. I might have time after my workshop tomorrow to update this slide deck. So I've got a few more of my bookmarks in this list. But I actually point out LiveSwitch Connect, and I already have this open in a web browser over here. We go to LiveSwitch Connect. So one of the things that I liked, and again, LiveSwitch isn't paying me for any of this. If you do feel like connecting with, I have a direct line to the CEO. So if any of you are interested in learning more about, potentially going with that, just, let me know. I'd be happy to connect you with Jared. But I really just, one of the things that I like about not working for any end of these companies is that I can remain relatively objective in how I evaluate these technologies. But one of the things that they recently introduced and open sourced is this LiveSwitch Connect CLI, and it basically lets you connect to that MCU on the LiveSwitch cloud, or if you're running your own LiveSwitch server. And again, you could do this with Janus. I was helping a client of mine with FFmpeg processing of a Janus a plugin, for lack of a better word, that essentially could do the same thing, where if you want to record an aggregate of a call, that you would be able to, basically have your own custom client join as a lurker into a call. You wouldn't see it show up as a participant, but you would be able to have your own service dial in or connect to the back end to basically get that feed so that you could do whatever you wanted with it from an archiving point of view, or even a relay point of view. And that's where I'll go back to that slide that I had earlier about relaying. And what I mean there is that basically you're able to take an aggregate experience from a WebRTC platform and take it to a non-WebRTC ingest. And so, one of the things that I was interested in, and one of the reasons I pushed on Jared to make that LiveSwitch Connect client available on GitHub was to, enable me, for example, to, take a MCU feed from a call and push it, into something else that could rebroadcast it. Because a lot of the work I'm doing right now, particularly with a webcasting company in Vancouver, is there is helping them orchestrate Zoom calls that don't use Zoom as the playback environment for the vast majority of people. So Zoom is only used to organize panelists, and we want to take that Zoom call and take it out to another provider. In this case, they work with an AGM provider that tracks online voting for people. Like right now, there's still a lot of annual group meetings happening for big corporations. Their year ends are typically in March, April, and May. And so those boards can't meet in person right now with COVID restrictions in place. And so they're having to run those meetings virtually. They'll use a platform like Zoom for those stakeholders to get together, but they need to take that out somewhere else. And so, in that example, we're going from Zoom, and we're not using Zoom's RTMP push. Zoom does have an RTMP out, but what's been more effective is that they have a technical director. And this is the good news for webcasters that are largely out of work, because live venues just aren't open anymore. You run your same control apparatus, whether it's Wirecast, vMix, or even OBS if you're tight on a budget, to basically do a screen capture of your Zoom session, and you then just have full control over where you push that. So they're doing an architecture where they do that. They capture Zoom. They don't have to rely on. The problem with Zoom and their RTMP out, like Zoom will let you take, like I could take this meeting right now, or Christopher could, if he's the controller of the account, enable an RTMP push out to Facebook, to YouTube. Zoom enables that pretty easily, and it's really nice, actually. Like if you wanted to take something to social media with a live call, Zoom lets you do that. Again, that's not WebRTC specific, but going back to WebRTC, that type of relay mechanism, I think, is key these days in order to disseminate, calls that don't need active participants, but there's still active viewers that want to participate live. Maybe they want to be part of a chat mechanism. Maybe, like with the BC Gov, they're pushing everything to Facebook and to get the daily, briefings that they are doing out to the citizens, the residents of British Columbia. So this relay feature is also neat because you can, if your WebRTC platform or stack doesn't support certain features, like, I mean, one of the things that, like, what if there's I call them Johnny come latelys, someone who's comes to this Zoom meeting late. I was late to this meeting, and if I wanted to rewind in the earlier presentation, I can't do that in Zoom. There's no ability for me to rewind into this live broadcast, but other media servers like Wowza have NDVR built in, so I can, if I have a WebRTC platform that has a tool like LiveSwitch does, and you can build your own with Janus or anything else that lets me, basically capture MCU bits out, and then using FFmpeg or whatever you want to do, push that to another ingest where you're using much cheaper HTTP edge architecture, then you've just got a lot more options there because, and that's going to become key with a lot of virtual events, I think, as we, go down this road, regardless of what restrictions are lifted. I think it's going to be a really iffy scenario moving forward about just who's going to be comfortable going into, a room with 1,000 people in it. It's probably, where who knows how far off we are to getting back to that. But, even if it's allowed, I think, every organization has now acknowledged that we need to have a virtual component to pretty much everything we're doing, because we're going to either lose sales, we're going to lose audience if we're not ready for it. And I think WebRTC is going to be big in that. It's going to be pivotal in that discussion because not everyone's going to be able to afford, building customized apps. One of the neat things about WebRTC now is that it works very consistently, even on mobile browser. Like I have a Toronto-based client, like I mentioned earlier, that we tried several different platforms, finally settled on Live Switch. And one of the things that was interesting about that scenario, I just lost my train of thought there real quickly. Oh, was that when we were testing, this is a real this is an anecdote that where I'm coming off of I had a trip to Victoria to do some BC Gov work, and I was pulling off at I don't know if you're familiar with the ferry system here on BC, in BC, if you've ever traveled out here, but you don't really have great reception in a lot of these ferry terminals, even in bigger ones. So as I was pulling off the ferry, I was really worried about being on this call that was being run through this very prototype setup. I wasn't running a native smartphone app. I was just using Safari iOS, and I was amazed at how well I could actually just use mobile browser. And I even put that question to the CEO of Frozen Mountain. I said, do we actually, what do you encourage people to do when it comes to the whole, like, do you need a smartphone app to run WebRTC? I mean, it's supposed to be this browser-friendly, standard, and Apple, and, just like any standard, it takes a long time for all the vendors to agree on how they're going to implement it. It's still, and I'm happy to say that I would say in the last 18 months, we finally have gotten to a place where Firefox, Chrome, Edge, and Safari, you can, generally have an experience that works completely browser-based with everyone on the call. I'm not going to say there's still problems with that. There's still a learning curve with a lot of developers that are, web developers, but they're not used to this real-time data handling, right? At the end of the day, this is all just data. So, reconnect logic, bandwidth testing, all these things that sort of I'm familiar with because I've been working with real-time protocols for most of my career. A lot of devs have a steep learning curve on just understanding how this synchronous communication works, and if a connection drops, how do you properly close a connection and open up a connection? One of my future articles or columns on streaming media is going to be a call to the industry to rally around something that is more of an open SDK that the industry may hopefully adopt. I certainly don't have a proposal ready on my own, but sure would be nice if there were. I don't know if anyone on this call remembers the days of Adobe's OSMF, as they call it, Open Source Media Framework, and that was largely because a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders didn't understand, and product owners didn't understand that Flash wasn't just a video player. A lot of people mistakenly just thought Flash was a video player, right, as a plugin, so Adobe had to, address that problem. Like, people just didn't understand that, you built a application that was then responsible for consuming video that uses the Flash runtime. And so one of Adobe's responses to that was the open source media framework, so that I could have a generic client framework that could connect to any number of HTTP or RTMP based service layers from any vendor. It didn't matter if it was Akamai. And if you were Akamai, Akamai built a plugin for OSMF. It gave everyone a centralized code base to use for media management. And that's a critical component that I feel is still missing with WebRTC, because like I mentioned earlier, when you invest right now in a WebRTC solution, you're sort of going all in on that solution, and you know, you're writing front end code that's using one of these vendors' SDKs, whether they're open source or not. You're married to that SDK as far as your front end. You can't just take, like, you know, change a connection string on your WebRTC SDK and then boom, it's going to work with another vendor. There are some nice JavaScript libraries out there for WebRTC peer-to-peer connections, but it's very limited, right? Because that's only peer-to-peer. And a lot of these server solutions are specific, right? Into like these SFU and MCU architectural differences. So definitely, you know, if any of you are considering like building out or looking into WebRTC distribution or are putting together WebRTC based experiences, you know, I would say spend more than your average amount of time in discovery for doing your due diligence. Make sure you spell out all of your business requirements in your long-term roadmaps. I would say, you know, have your roadmap planned out for, you know, at least the next 24 months, and make sure that the architectures that you're going to invest in are going to support that, because, you know, you don't want to be halfway through that roadmap and then realize you're hitting a wall, or hitting, you know, oh my gosh, we're going to have to license X, you know, X, Y, and Z in order to do that. And we're going to have to adjust all of this stuff that we just did. So, you know, I think there's a tendency right now, things are calming down a little bit, but, you know, for people to rush into these engagements, like, we need something now and we need to put it together, and they rush their discovery and due diligence, and that never plays out well, even in the best of times. And so, you know, it's important to keep those mindsets in place when you're looking at WebRTC for the for, you know, whatever rollout you're planning to do. I might be over time already. I have these resources available in this PDF. I'll make it available. I'll just go ahead and jump right into QA mode now. And if anyone wants to ask questions, I'll be happy to answer as many as I can related to WebRTC. I hope this was on point with what many of you may have hoped to have heard about WebRTC, or at least, you know, was useful in some way. Christopher, do we just open this up to chat, or?
Yep. Yeah, if any of the participants, you can just go ahead and unmute your mic, or if anyone has any questions.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
And feel free, there's my contact information. If you have questions that come up after this, you know, I make myself pretty available with complimentary support to many people who just, you know, watch any of my presentations. So feel free to reach out even afterwards if you have questions. I am on the Slack group, the video dev Slack group that Christopher found me on. So happy to, you know, any way that you can reach me, happy to answer questions there.
Well, thanks, Robert, for joining us in the morning from BC. Thanks for the talk. So with that, I'll turn it over